Wonderful. Let's get underway. Thank you so much for attending. I hope this has been a good first day of Hadoop Summit. Did you have a chance to attend the meetup yesterday? There were a few folks who attended the meetup. Okay, thank you. And one other question to help get started. Who here today has used Splunk software, that you're personally familiar with Splunk? I see several hands. And for those who are working with Hadoop, how many of you have organizations where you have Hadoop clusters in production today? Wonderful. It's about half the audience. Oh, thank you. So my name is Brett Shepard. I'm Director of Big Data at Splunk Software, headquartered in San Francisco. And it's a pleasure to join you today. And please do make this interactive. You're welcome to ask questions at any point. This session is for you, so please do ask questions so that you get the most value from today. And as I mentioned, my email is data@splunk.com. So if you would like copies of the slides or have any follow-up, feel free to email me. In addition to, we have the Splunk booth downstairs in the exhibit hall. Some background about Splunk. We are a 10-year-old company. Our annual revenues are just north of $300 million a year, and we have a little over 1,000 employees, including we have operations in London as our EMEA headquarters, together with many of my colleagues here today are based in Central and Middle Europe. And we are pleased to work with customers in more than 90 countries. Our largest customers ingest into Splunk Enterprise over 100 terabytes a day. And so, for example, in the cable internet industry, Comcast is one of those customers that ingests in over 100 terabytes a day. So they bring into our analytics platform the equivalent of a petabyte of data every 10 days. And we work with all of the Hadoop distribution vendors who are here at the show. Some background about how at Splunk we think about big data, in that our focus is on raw, unstructured data that may be coming from this computer, it may be coming from your cell phone, it may come from a data center. Likewise, even in this building, the heating and ventilation systems, the lights, all are often generating some type of sensor data. And not only is this data growing in volumes, there's a need to understand it in real time, and also there's a lot of variability. So one of the reasons customers come to Splunk is that we help address formats that change over time. So every system that generates data will often vary its formats over the span of months or years. And we help you to be able to understand all of this type of very diverse machine data that is raw, unstructured, or polystructured data. An example here of cars, so that if you attended CeBIT, you may have seen a dashboard from Volkswagen. And Volkswagen took car sensor data into Splunk software specifically for their electric vehicles. And they're able to understand driver behavior and very detailed things about acceleration and torque and the ability to stop the car, as well as things from the car's info entertainment systems, and be able to understand that in Splunk software. Likewise, Vodafone is a Splunk customer and works with Splunk to improve their service delivery. And they found that by working with their software, they've been able to reduce the escalations in their IT operations by over 90%, and that they use Splunk to get real-time visibility into their operations. And this can include from cell towers, it includes from their transmission systems, as well as from their data centers and applications and security software. A major global bank is working with our product named Hunk for data in Hadoop. And they started off with what they felt were just petabytes of seemingly random numbers, but found business value. And they were, in particular, they were able to look at their loan portfolio down to each loan, each investment, and all the steps in the investment process of the person who is applying for a loan or high-speed transactions on the stock exchanges, the bids, the receiving amounts, and they're able to do that across the span of years' worth of data in Hadoop and inform what in the banking industry they call the Tier 1 capital ratio, which sounds rather arcane, but it's a major priority for this global bank because it affects how much money they need to keep in reserve to account for losses in their portfolio. So it's something that their CEO and CFO, it's one of their top 3 concerns, not just for their IT department, but more importantly for their bank as a whole. And one of the core premises for Splunk software, and what brings us here to Hadoop Summit in EMEA, is that big data does not have to be a science project. That this is an example of a cartoon by Rube Goldberg. You may remember Rube Goldberg in your science classes, where, in this case, he took something that was seemingly very simple and has a lot of steps. So the gentleman sleeping here wanted an alarm clock. So in his system, the early bird arrives, catches the worm, fires a gun, hits the balloon, drops a brick, fills an atomizer with perfume, and that then drops a cannonball into his face. Along with it, pulls a container of cold water in his face. The result is very effective. If a cannonball went in my face with cold water, I would wake up. The problem is each step depends on the previous step. And any one step fails, your system fails. And while this is a comic, today this is the way that ETL is, or extract, transform, load, in many of our customer environments. That it is a set of manual processes that need to occur, and they have dependencies among each other. And that results in a lot of people time, it results in downtime, and it creates risk for the organization. And a core premise of Splunk software is that you can work with big data, and it does not need to be a science project like this Rube Goldberg cartoon. And ideally, you can make the data discovery process easier. I started my own career as an analyst. I worked for the U.S. Department of Defense, and I worked for Gartner Group, an industry analyst firm. And this was my life. I would collect data, and then I would spend a lot of time preparing it before I could ask questions. So in the case of Department of Defense, I had fixed terminals, and my biggest technology aid was a chair with wheels on it, because I would run a query on one terminal, and I would wheel over and run another query, and wheel over to the third terminal, and go back and forth and see which one was done yet. And so I spent a lot of time just preparing the data before I could even begin to understand it or analyze it. And what many customers tell us is that they want to swap that ratio. They want to go from spending 80% of time in collecting and preparing the data to be able to spend 80% of their time on asking questions. And that's particularly problematic today in areas of Hadoop, where if you're using Apache Hive or SQL on Hadoop, you need to write fixed schemas to help put data in a columnar or row format to be able to understand it. And that's fine if you have a small number of data sources or a small number of use cases. But once you start to get into disparate data from dozens of different sources, you end up having to spend a lot of time on prepare versus enabling people in your organization to do self-service analytics. And I have an example here of what, from a Splunk perspective, we mean by machine data. And this is what the raw data looks like. In this case, a customer has had a bad experience on a website. They tried to make a transaction. It failed. That generates a middleware error. They then call into the phone center, the Interactive Voice Response System, or IVR. They're put on hold, and they get frustrated, and they tweet about it. That story is very difficult to tell as human beings in just looking at these logs. And it's particularly difficult if you have millions of customers like Vodafone does, for example. What our software does is when you bring data into Splunk software, it automatically breaks it in terms of events and timestamps and source ID, and you're able to correlate across disparate data. And so you're able to see that customer ID, in fact, conforms to the Twitter ID. And you can do joins across these sets of data on any common variable. And so the Twitter ID may well be different. So my Twitter ID is Zetaforce. My name is Brett Shepard. But they both have the same address. They have the same IP address, as well as a physical address. And any type of common data point, you're able to share across these disparate data sources and see this both in real time as well as historical data that's stored in Hadoop. And I'll show some demos later of what I mean by this and how you can apply it. And for background on customers' architectures, that you ingest in a variety of data, and you can use technologies like Flume. Are any in the audience, are you using Flume today? Or I see some, or how has your experience been with Flume? Is it something that it just works? That's good. And we have customers like Comcast that they've evaluated Flume, but for their use cases it was problematic because they have tens of thousands of content delivery nodes as well as millions of set-top boxes, and Flume uses Java, so it has a Java JVM, and they didn't want any external dependencies residing on their network infrastructure or cable set-top boxes. So one of the things that you find for Splunk software is you have the option to use what we call a universal forwarder, where you can ingest data directly without having to use tools such as Flume or Scribe or Chukwa. But you can obviously choose which tools that you want, but we give you some additional capabilities with our managed forwarders, both the lightweight one that sends everything as well as a heavyweight forwarder, so you could actually parse at the data source to say, I only want logs with these certain characteristics that I want to then forward on to analyze and store. And so what Splunk Enterprise does is it enables you to analyze data in real time before the data is even persisted. And this is particularly valuable, for example, for sports. So Comcast and NBC were one of the broadcasters for the Sochi Winter Olympics. And at the Strata show in California, they showed live dashboards of how they were able to monitor the coverage from the Olympics in real time. And so if a problem occurred at 3 o'clock in the morning, local time, that they are able to see that immediately and troubleshoot it using our Splunk software. And as you'll see when I show some examples of, you're able to take raw data, whether it's ingested into Splunk Enterprise or is stored in Hadoop, and be able to search and analyze and visualize that data with role-based access security. And so if you're using Kerberos, or if you're using some of the newer security paradigms, for example, ones that Cloudera and Hortonworks are working on, that you can integrate that with role-based access in the Splunk software. And it's good to have extensibility. And so one of the things that we find from customers is that it's particularly helpful when you choose an analytics platform that allows your developers to use the tools and frameworks they already know, versus, for example, doing manual programming in MapReduce or writing schemas in Hive. And so one of the things that we built over the last 10 years is the ability to use whatever the developers prefer. And so it might be an iframe or Python or C#, and you're able to use a REST API, which is the underlying approach for all of our software, and to be able to build big data apps on top of Splunk software and data in Hadoop. And this is one kind of recommendation for you in terms of whether you use Splunk software or use other approaches in the industry. Think about how developers can use the tools and frameworks that they already know and like versus having to learn something new. And while there are many leading innovators in Hadoop today, I fly from here to Munich and are meeting companies like Alliance and Volkswagen that have production Hadoop clusters. About half the audience raised your hand that you have Hadoop in production today, which is fantastic. What our customers have been telling us is that they've been able to spin up their clusters and get data in. Their challenge has been how to do analytics of that data. And so when I did my Hadoop sysadmin certification, I took a 3-day class from Cloudera. Hortonworks and others offer similar courses. And in those 3 days, I learned how to set up a Hadoop cluster, import data in through the HDFS API, and run MapReduce jobs. It's a much more specialized skills to be able to work with Apache Hive or SQL on Hadoop. And that's why that our customers and partners have been enthusiastic about what I'll show you today, a product named Hunk. And the CTOs of Cloudera and Hortonworks and MapR have all been very bullish, and they attended our customer conference for Splunk and also talk about Splunk software on the demo floor and in their own presentations because of the ability to do analytics without having to define any schemas and without having to export data out of Hadoop. That I was just talking over lunch with colleagues from SAP about HANA, and there are wonderful ways that you can take data from Hadoop and decide on a subset of that data that you want to export into an in-memory store, such as SAP HANA or Tableau or other options for in-memory stores. But there's also value of keeping data in Hadoop, persisting it, and not having to move it. Many customers tell us that they don't want to move data. It's a security risk, it costs money, it creates problems to have duplicate copies of data. And so they'd like to use an approach like our software named Hunk for data at rest in Hadoop. And it's a funny name, we like it. It started off as a project name. Our CEO thought our product name sounded very boring, of Splunk Analytics for Hadoop. And so he said, why don't we use this name Hunk? So it does mean I need to exercise more regularly, so I start to feel more like a hunk and less like a geek. And last slide before I show some software and take your questions is, what's special about Hunk? Why should you consider it in addition to all of the other options within the Hadoop ecosystem, whether it's the projects and sub-projects in open source or whether it's commercial software like Splunk? And there are 4 things that our customers find that they really find value from Hunk. Otto Group, for example, a major retailer based in Germany, that found that they could connect to Hunk and get started very quickly, have a full-featured set of analytics with schema on the fly, interactively question data. As you'll see in the demo, in Hunk, we do the reduce phase in Hunk so that the results come streaming in and you're able to pause and stop jobs and refine your queries, and that have those jobs also get stopped in the Hadoop cluster, so you're not tying up the cluster resources. And lastly, the developer environment that I mentioned in terms of the ability to build big data apps on top of data in Hadoop. And with that, I'd like to ask a few questions as we're shifting over to show some software demos. So any questions that I can answer for you as we switch over to the demos? Yes, sir. Okay, and so the question is, how synchronized is Splunk with the Apache Dupe projects? So we are contributors to the Apache Software Foundation, and so we have contributors for Hadoop, for Apache Cassandra, and we work with related tools such as R, and we also have over 400 partners and employees and customers that have built apps on top of Splunk software, and all but a handful of those are free apps that, whether they're open source or freely available to Splunk customers. And so we very much see the benefit of Hadoop, and Hadoop being led by the open source community. And what I'm showing you here is an example of the product that I mentioned named Hunk. And this is a dashboard that is taking data from HDFS. It happens to be a Hortonworks cluster residing in Amazon Web Services. It could just as well be Cloudera or MapR or IBM or Pivotal. We work with all of the major Hadoop distributions as well as the Apache downloads. And what you see here are information on sales and on data by time and page views. And so this is taking a couple of data sources, Apache web logs and data on transactions that are stored in Hadoop. And really the secret sauce of Splunk is the ability to always drill down to the underlying raw data. And so what I'll show you here is this raw data that is in Hadoop, and you're able to, without understanding anything about the data, I've just now searched that Hadoop cluster, and Splunk has automatically broken out the raw unstructured data in terms of selected and interesting fields. And this is something that is special about Splunk, and it's very simple but elegant in terms of breaking data into a variety of key value pairs, whether it's source ID or IP address or customer name or product name, and being able to understand this. And so if, for example, I want to click on product name, let's say I'm an e-commerce analyst, want to drill down to understand what is affecting my sales by product, I could look, for example, at individual products. I can look at top values by time, rare values, and all of this is point and click. And this is data that I don't have to know anything about in terms of the structure of the data. I don't have to understand the Apache web logs or the transactions. I'm able to look across those disparate sources of data stored in Hadoop and be able to look at what are my outliers. So what is this particular drop here? Is this something meaningful for my business? And just be able to click to drill down and get the underlying raw data and find patterns across it. And so this is how Vodafone, for example, is able to look at dropped calls and compare that to customer records to see, is there relationships between number of dropped calls and churn, or the amount of usage of mobile data apps. And that you're able to, in this software, as a flexible analytics platform on top of data in Hadoop, be able to search that data as well as be able to analyze and visualize it. And so you can then show this data as a dashboard that your business users, your corporate executives, your partners can use, and to be able to understand your business better, all with raw, unstructured data in Hadoop that does not require any fixed schemas. One last thing that I'll mention about Hunk is that Hunk is just one of the services that may connect to your Hadoop cluster. And so that if you have colleagues or yourselves are using SQL on Hadoop or using Apache Hive, you can continue to run those jobs against your Hadoop cluster and use role-based access controls in Hunk to be able to assign those roles in your Hadoop cluster, do queue management in terms of which roles or which jobs take priority. And so Hunk does not prevent anything that you're doing today with your Hadoop clusters, but adds additional capabilities for self-service analytics, including an example here to be able to automatically predict sales and look at anomalies. The one thing I should show you is I mentioned that Hunk takes data through the reduce phase and actually does the reduce phase in Hunk. And that's something I've not seen in other options in the open source ecosystem. And so it's something that is particularly interesting and I believe unique about Hunk is the ability to, in this case, the job ran very quickly. But what if I run a more complex job that may take some time to run? I have the ability to pause this job in Hunk and see a set of interim results and continue to refine it. And this is very valuable for a business analyst or e-commerce analyst. You're not having to wait for the full map and reduce steps to occur before you see any results. And so if that query might normally run for 30 seconds, a few minutes, you're able to stop a job and say, okay, I'm going to drill down and look at a specific product and refine that query and be able to iterate as you go. And this is all done with the data in Hadoop. It's not transferring data into memory. Hunk does not persist the data. We only persist the search results, and so you're able to have acceleration and not have to repeat the same queries if it's a repeated query. And with that, I would be delighted to take more questions, any things that I can show you, any things that I can share in terms of our experiences of working in the Hadoop ecosystem and working with customers such as Vodafone or Comcast or the banks that I mentioned in terms of their work with Hadoop. Yes, sir. Wonderful. So the question is, what can I tell about the performance of Hunk? And a couple of things. One is Hunk is very lightweight in terms of hardware. Since the data is not persisted, you only need a handful of Hunk nodes because it's you're not having to transfer large amounts of data and persist them. And the number of nodes is really based on concurrency. And so we have customers that have hundreds of colleagues who are using data where you may want multiple nodes for that. But regardless, it's a very low footprint in terms of hardware. In terms of the streaming interface that I just showed you, that speeds results dramatically. And so if I run a search here, you notice that, and I'll run kind of another search, and you'll see how quickly the interim results start coming in. And those come within a matter of seconds versus even if when you try to speed up MapReduce and use, for example, Yarn that we also support in Hunk, that it does take a few seconds for the MapReduce jobs to spin up, run, and come back. And you get much more rapid results that are not the complete results. The full results still depend on the full MapReduce jobs to finish, but that preliminary results allow you to have an interactive experience and pause and refine your questions. And it's also priced affordably. My colleagues in sales would like me to say that. So, yes. Exactly. So the question is, what do we require in terms of Hadoop projects and subprojects? Only HDFS and MapReduce. You can use whatever you want on top of that in terms of Kerberos. If you want to use Aussie as a workflow manager, you can use Apache Avro for data formats, but none of those are required. Yes, sir. Yes, very good question. And the question was, are we finding customers who are primarily using Hunk for machine data, or what about other data types? And it's a very good question in that we have customers who are either in production with Hunk or doing POCs with Hunk, looking at binary data that our Splunk Enterprise does not handle very well, and raw image files, video files. And so being able to look through videos for facial recognition or pattern recognition that you're able to do in Hadoop, that is not something that Splunk in our core platform supports well. And so our enterprise security app, for example, has a partner plugin to support binary data. In the case of binary data in Hadoop, those strings of numbers you're able to analyze using the power of MapReduce with the streaming results. And so yes, one of the benefits for customers here today who are already using Splunk for traditional machine data and sensor data use cases is that you can do a variety of new file formats, including human-generated content that might be Microsoft Office files you want to do text searches of. The same interface that I'm showing here works very well if you want to do a keyword search for data that may be in Word files, for example. Yes, sir. Yes. And so the question was, what about Avro and Parquet? So Avro is supported today. I can actually show you the connection screens where you can put in the Avro data formats. The Parquet is coming. It's in our next version of Hunk. We will be supporting Parquet, ORC file, text files, and if those are automatically supported, so you don't have to do any things to tell the software what it is, and it allows you to use those compression formats. And so we have customers in Australia, for example, using Hunk today with Parquet, and in our works with Hortonworks, they are quite eager about ORC file. We also, incidentally, if you're attending the TES discussions with Hortonworks, that we have that as part of our roadmap. And so today, MapReduce is a 1-2 step. TES, you can have 2 or 3, 4 or 5 data processing pipeline that we'll also be able to support within Hunk. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely. A very good question. So what about taking visuals here and exporting them? Yes, you have a variety of options. First of all, you can use visuals such as D3 that may not be supported in our software. And in terms of exporting it, you can embed this in other dashboards. And so this could be in your business intelligence software. We have an ODBC driver that you can connect to a business intelligence software. You can also use an iframe. And so if this is something that you want people to see on their mobile device, you can embed this directly as an iframe. Certainly. Absolutely. And we have customers today that take from Splunk software, and once Splunk takes that raw unstructured data and puts it in a format that looks more like a row and columnar format, that you can, we have an app called DB Connect that you can export to a relational database. So we have customers that export to SAP HANA or HP Vertica. Likewise, you can also enrich results in Splunk software. And so if you have data in a relational database that you want to import in, you can also do so. It's a bidirectional. And I was going to mention, by the way, and apologies, it's a little hard to read here, but these are the actual settings. And if you have admin access, you see this screen. If you don't have admin access, then you actually, it's not listed here. And so a business user doesn't get to see this. That way you can maintain corporate governance. But, and again, apologies, it's hard to see. But in addition to specifying Hadoop 1.0 and Yarn, you can define data formats like in Avro. You can do time partitioning. And all of those help improve performance. And likewise, you can define individual paths that we call a virtual index. And that way you can, if you only want people to access certain parts of the cluster, you don't have to break into separate clusters. I saw a customer said, we're thinking about having 60 nodes of Hadoop, 10 nodes each, because we only want to have certain people who can access each cluster. We're like, that's, don't have 10 or 6 separate clusters. Define a path, and so that's what in our software we call a virtual index. You can define that path in whitelist or blacklist data. The other interesting thing that you can also do that is very popular, that one of the largest internet companies that helped to found Hadoop is using Hunk. And one of the first things that they asked us for was the ability to mask data, because they have customer non-public information, and all the raw data is stored in Hadoop. In the software, you're able to mask the data and assign it by role. And it's just a simple regex command. And so that if, for example, my colleague Mark in the back, he may have access to everything because he works in the finance department. If I'm working as a sales engineer, when I do the same search, I see that data with XXX over the person's passport number or their credit card number. And all of that are things that you're able to do in the admin views, that when someone is a line of business user, they don't even see that screen, so that they're blocked out from being able to either inadvertently change something or do something maliciously. Yes, sir. Yes. So can you filter a data based on a rule? Absolutely. And so, in fact, that's a great point that I can show, that we have what we call a data model. And this is a way to assign a set of rules that you may have elsewhere in your enterprise architecture, and that you want to use it for data in Hadoop, or it may be rules that are specific to your data in Hadoop, and you're able to define what these labels are and what are the associated filters of data. And so which data has a virtual index under this term. And you can whitelist data, blacklist data, assign time periods, and enable someone who is not an expert in Hadoop to be able to simply take this and drag and drop to create their own visuals and publish them as dashboards. And so you're able to take those data models and be able to drag and create a pivot table all based on what you've decided as those set of filters and category terms. A very good question. Thank you. I think we are just a few minutes over. I maybe take one last question. Yes, sir. So the question is it possible to schedule a job to run continuously over time? Yes, you can. We could talk more offline. The question is, would you want to do that? Because we have the ability to cache results. And so if it's a repeated query, you might want to cache the results and only search for what's new versus having an ongoing job. But you can schedule reports and alerts. And so you can decide that you want to take a certain set of questions or a certain dashboard that you want to publish, say, every hour. And you're able to schedule that, and it will run the job just for that specific alert or report. So, and I see we're just a few minutes over. Want to give you time for a break before the next session. Thank you very much for attending and for your excellent questions. Myself and my colleagues are here, happy to talk with you during the break or down in the show floor. So thank you very much.